Go ahead, my daughter-in-law said with a smile that never reached her eyes. Everyone already knows who really matters in this family. A second later, a splash of red stained my silver hair, my dress, and the white tablecloth beside me. The ballroom fell silent. For a moment nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the music seemed distant. I sat perfectly still, feeling the cool drops slide down my cheek. Across the room, crystal chandeliers glowed above hundreds of guests who had gathered to celebrate my son's wedding. It should have been one of the happiest days of my life. Instead, it became the day I learned exactly where I stood in my own family. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I was 68 years old that afternoon, a widow for nearly 6 years, and the woman who had spent most of her life putting her family before herself. I looked toward my son Ryan, waiting for him to say something. Anything. A joke. An apology. A simple "Mom, are you okay?" But he only shifted his weight and looked away. That hurt far more than the wine ever could. Vanessa stood beside him in her designer wedding gown, one hand resting on his arm. Her expression carried the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. Around us, guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few pretended not to notice. Others suddenly became fascinated with their phones. I reached for a linen napkin and gently dabbed my face. My hands did not shake. At least not where anyone could see. "Eleanor," someone whispered from a nearby table. "Are you all right?" I offered a small smile. "I'm fine." The word surprised even me. Fine was not the right word. Embarrassed, disappointed, heartbroken. Those would have been closer to the truth. But I had learned something over the years. Dignity often speaks louder than anger. Vanessa laughed softly and turned back toward her friends as if nothing important had happened. The reception gradually returned to life. Conversations resumed. Glasses clinked. A band started another song. The wedding continued. Yet something fundamental had changed. Not in the room. In me. As I sat there, I remembered all the checks I had written for this wedding. The venue overlooking the lake. The flowers flown in from California. The catering menu Vanessa had changed 3 times before finally approving it. Every detail had been carefully chosen. Every invoice had passed through my hands. I had told myself I was helping Ryan begin a beautiful new chapter. Looking around that ballroom, I suddenly realized I had been funding my own humiliation. A server approached and quietly offered to bring me another dress from the bridal suite. I thanked her but declined. Instead, I stood and smoothed the fabric of my stained outfit. The room seemed to watch me from the corners of their eyes. They expected tears. They expected outrage. They expected a scene. I gave them none. I picked up my purse, walked calmly through the ballroom, and headed toward the exit. The cool evening air greeted me as I stepped outside. Behind me, laughter drifted through the open doors. In front of me stretched a parking lot illuminated by soft golden lights. I paused beside my car and looked back at the building one last time. Then I smiled. Not because I was happy. Not because I forgave what had happened. I smiled because for the first time I understood something Vanessa and Ryan did not. They believed that embarrassing an old woman carried no consequences. They believed the future already belonged to them. They believed the house would eventually be theirs. What they did not know was that the house belonged entirely to me. And before the leaves changed color that fall, I would make a decision that neither of them saw coming. The wine would dry. The stain would fade. But the lesson they were about to learn would last much longer. The drive home felt longer than usual that evening. The city lights blurred beyond my windshield as I followed the familiar roads back to the house I had lived in for more than 30 years. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the celebration was probably still going strong. Guests were dancing. Glasses were raised. Photographs were being taken. The perfect wedding album was being created, one smiling picture at a time. I stepped inside my house and closed the front door behind me. The silence wrapped around me immediately. It was the kind of silence that only existed in a home that had once been full. I placed my purse on the hallway table and looked around. The framed photographs were exactly where they had always been. Ryan in his Little League uniform. Ryan at his high school graduation. Ryan standing beside his father on a fishing trip years ago. For a long moment I simply stood there. Then I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. The wedding venue had overlooked a beautiful lake, But this kitchen had witnessed the real story of our family. Birthday cakes had been baked here. School lunches had been packed here. Bills had been paid at the small oak table beside the window. I sat down and stared at the empty chair across from me. My late husband, Charles, used to sit there every morning with a newspaper and a cup of coffee. Even after 6 years, I could almost imagine hearing him clear his throat before commenting on the headlines. Sometimes grief does not arrive like a storm. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as memory. I finished my water and opened the refrigerator. A container of pasta salad sat on the top shelf. I had prepared it 2 days earlier because Vanessa had requested additional side dishes for the rehearsal dinner. I remember driving across town for specialty ingredients because she wanted everything to be perfect. That word suddenly made me smile. Perfect. No matter how much I had done, it was never enough. Looking back, I could see the pattern more clearly than ever. It had started years ago with small things. Invitations arriving late. Family plans made without including me. Holidays shortened because Vanessa claimed they had other commitments. At the time, I convinced myself not to take it personally. Families changed. Children grew up. Life became busy. That was what I told myself. But sitting alone in my kitchen that night, I realized something uncomfortable. Every compromise had moved in one direction. Every adjustment had been expected from me, never from them. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. A message from Ryan appeared on the screen. It contained only 3 words. Hope you made it home safely. I stared at the text for several seconds. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Not even a question about how I felt. Just a polite sentence that sounded as though it had been written to a distant acquaintance. I set the phone face down on the table. For the first time, I did not rush to protect him in my mind. I did not search for excuses. I did not blame stress or wedding nerves. He was 38 years old. He had watched what happened, and he had chosen silence. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as the hours passed. Eventually, I walked upstairs and entered my bedroom. Moonlight spilled through the curtains, casting pale shadows across the floor. On top of the dresser sat a framed photograph of Charles. I picked it up and smiled softly. He had always been able to see through people. More than once he had warned me that kindness should never be confused with surrender. At the time I thought he was being overly cautious. Now I wondered if he had understood something I had refused to see. I placed the photograph back on the dresser and opened the drawer beneath it. Inside rested a folder containing property records, financial documents, and paperwork that had not been touched in years. My fingers lingered on the folder for a moment before I closed the drawer again. Not yet. There was still more I needed to understand. But one thing had become clear. The woman who walked into that wedding ballroom believed she was helping her family build a future. The woman who returned home understood that she needed to protect her own. The next morning arrived with the kind of quiet that makes every sound seem louder. I woke before sunrise and wandered downstairs, unable to shake the thoughts that had followed me through the night. The kitchen window overlooked the backyard where Ryan used to spend entire summers. I could still picture him racing across the grass with a plastic baseball bat, begging his father to pitch one more ball before dinner. Back then, our home felt like the center of his world. Somewhere along the way, that changed. I made a cup of coffee and carried it to the breakfast nook. The chair across from me remained empty, but the memories were not. As the first light spread across the yard, I found myself replaying moments from the past several years. Little things, small conversations, tiny incidents I had dismissed at the time. Vanessa had always been careful. She rarely said anything openly cruel. Instead, she worked through suggestions, through exclusions, through subtle remarks that sounded harmless until you looked at the full picture. I remembered a Christmas dinner 3 years earlier when she insisted they spend the holiday with her relatives because it was only fair. The following year, the same thing happened. Then came birthdays celebrated at restaurants I was never told about until afterward. Weekend trips I learned about through photographs online. Family decisions that somehow became final before I even knew discussions had started. Each event seemed insignificant on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. The screen displayed Ryan's name. I let it ring twice before answering. "Good morning, Mom," he said. His voice sounded cautious. "Good morning." A brief silence followed. "How are you feeling?" he asked. It was the first time he had asked since the wedding. I am fine, I replied. Another pause. Vanessa feels terrible about what happened. The words settled heavily between us. Not because I believed them, but because of how quickly he said them. As though the matter could be resolved with a single sentence. Does she? I asked quietly. Ryan cleared his throat. Things got emotional. Weddings are stressful. I stared out the window at the maple tree in the backyard. Stress does not usually reveal something that was not already there. He did not answer immediately. Mom, can we not make this into a bigger issue than it is? There it was. The sentence that changed everything. Not because it was cruel. Because it was revealing. In his mind, the problem was not what happened. The problem was my reaction to it. After we ended the call, I sat motionless for several minutes. Then I walked upstairs and opened the hall closet. Inside were dozens of photo albums. I carried several downstairs and spread them across the dining room table. Hour after hour, I turned pages filled with birthdays, graduations, vacations, and family gatherings. Ryan smiled in every chapter of his life. So did I. Yet somewhere in those years I had become less of a person and more of a resource. Less of a mother and more of a convenience. By late afternoon I reached the final album. Tucked between two photographs was an old handwritten note from Charles. The paper had yellowed with age. His handwriting remained unmistakable. The message was short. It simply reminded me never to underestimate my own worth. I sat there holding that note for a long time. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the trees. Inside, something within me became steady. For years, I had focused on preserving relationships at any cost. Now I began to wonder what those relationships were actually costing me. 2 days later, I found myself standing in the upstairs hallway outside Ryan's old bedroom. The door was slightly open. I had not entered that room in months. After the wedding, the house felt different. As though it were quietly asking me to pay attention to things I had ignored for too long. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room no longer belonged to the little boy who once covered the walls with baseball posters and science fair ribbons. Most of those memories had been packed away years ago. Still, traces remained. A small dent near the closet door where he had accidentally thrown a basketball indoors. Faded marks on the wall where shelves once hung. Tiny reminders that this house had witnessed an entire lifetime. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. For years, I had believed that preserving a family meant accepting disappointments without complaint. I thought sacrifice was simply part of being a mother. But as I sat there, another question emerged. How much sacrifice was too much? My phone vibrated. This time it was a message from Vanessa. The first direct communication she had sent since the wedding. I opened it slowly. The message was surprisingly short. I hope there are no hard feelings. Weddings can be emotional. I read it twice. Not once did the message contain the word sorry. Not once did it acknowledge what had actually happened. The responsibility had somehow been assigned to emotion itself, as though emotion had acted independently and nobody was accountable. I placed the phone down and stared out the window. Beyond the backyard fence, the neighborhood looked peaceful. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. A golden retriever trotted behind a jogger. Ordinary life continued exactly as it always had. Yet something inside me had shifted permanently. That afternoon, I drove to a nearby cafe where I occasionally met old friends. The place smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon pastries. As I waited for my tea, I noticed 2 women around my age seated near the front window. They were laughing about retirement plans and discussing places they hoped to visit. Their conversation reminded me of something uncomfortable. For years, my future plans had revolved around other people. Helping Ryan. Supporting family events. Being available whenever someone needed me. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped asking what I wanted. The realization followed me home. That evening, I opened several drawers in my home office and began sorting through old paperwork. Insurance statements. Tax records. Property documents. Decades of carefully organized files. Charles had always insisted on keeping everything in order. "One day you will be glad we did," he used to say. As the sun lowered outside, I came across a folder labeled Estate and Property. My hand paused. For a moment, I considered putting it back without opening it. Instead, I carried it to the dining room table. Dust floated through the late afternoon sunlight as I carefully reviewed the contents. Deeds, surveys, purchase agreements, records stretching back more than 30 years. The deeper I looked, the more questions began to form. Certain details did not match assumptions I had heard Ryan and Vanessa make over the years. Certain conversations suddenly sounded different in hindsight. By the time darkness settled outside, I knew I needed answers from someone who understood every document inside that folder. There was only one person I trusted for that. Thomas Callahan had been our family's attorney for decades. He had helped Charles navigate business contracts, retirement planning, and countless legal matters. More importantly, he was a man who respected facts more than emotions. I glanced at the clock. It was too late to call that evening. Still, I picked up my phone and typed a brief message requesting a meeting. A few minutes later, a reply arrived. Tomorrow at 10. I will make time. I set the phone down and looked once more at the folder spread across the table. For the first time since the wedding, I felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not sadness. Clarity. And clarity can be a very powerful thing. The following morning, I arrived at Thomas Callahan's office 10 minutes early. His building stood in the older part of town, surrounded by brick storefronts and towering oak trees that had been there longer than most of the businesses. I had walked through those doors many times over the years, usually alongside Charles. Back then, legal meetings felt routine, necessary but rarely memorable. This visit felt different. Thomas greeted me warmly and led me into his office. The room looked exactly as I remembered. Shelves lined with law books, framed certificates on the walls, a large wooden desk polished to a soft shine. He offered me coffee, which I declined, then settled into the chair across from me. "Your message sounded important," he said. I placed the property folder on his desk. "I need to understand something." He opened the folder and began reviewing the documents. For several minutes, the only sounds were the turning of pages and the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Thomas adjusted his glasses and continued reading. The longer he examined the paperwork, the more thoughtful his expression became. Finally, he looked up. "What exactly are you concerned about?" I hesitated before answering. "I think certain assumptions have been made about my house." Thomas nodded slowly. "Tell me more." I explained everything. The wedding, the comments over the years, the conversations that increasingly revolved around what would happen to the property in the future. I described how Ryan and Vanessa often spoke as though ownership had already been decided. Thomas listened without interruption. When I finished, he folded his hands together and leaned back in his chair. "Eleanor, I believe there is something important you need to hear." My stomach tightened. He opened another file from his cabinet and placed it beside the documents I had brought. "Your husband was very thorough. Years ago, we reviewed every aspect of your estate plan." He slid several pages toward me. "This property was structured differently than most people would assume." I studied the papers carefully. Legal language filled every page. Yet one fact became clear almost immediately. The house belonged entirely to me. Not partially. Not conditionally. Completely. Thomas pointed to specific sections and explained them in plain language. The ownership transfer had been finalized years earlier. Every document had been properly recorded. Every legal requirement had been met. There were no hidden complications. No competing claims. No obligations requiring the property to pass directly to Ryan. I sat quietly absorbing the information. Thomas watched me carefully. "Did you know this?" he asked. "Not in this level of detail," I admitted. "Charles handled most of these discussions." Thomas smiled faintly. "He wanted to make sure you would always have options." Options. The word lingered in my mind. For weeks, I had felt trapped inside a story someone else was writing for me. Suddenly, that feeling began to disappear. We spent another hour reviewing financial records and property information. By the end of the meeting, every question had been answered. As I gathered the documents to leave, Thomas spoke one final time. "Eleanor, sometimes people become very confident when they believe the future is guaranteed. The problem is that guarantees rarely exist." Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the sidewalk as I walked back to my car. The folder rested on the passenger seat beside me. For the first time since the wedding, I felt neither wounded nor confused. I felt informed, and knowledge has a way of changing everything. When I arrived home, I placed the folder on the kitchen table and simply looked at it for a while. Nothing about the house had changed. The walls were the same. The hardwood floors still creaked in familiar places. Sunlight still crossed the living room every afternoon exactly the way it had for decades. Yet everything felt different because I finally understood the truth. For years, I had been living inside assumptions created by other people. Now I had facts. Over the next several days, I settled into a new routine. Every morning, I drank coffee on the back patio and watched the neighborhood wake up. Children waited for school buses. Neighbors walked their dogs. Delivery trucks rolled through the streets. Life continued normally. Meanwhile, I began looking at my own future with fresh eyes. One afternoon, I drove to a lakeside community about 40 miles away. Charles and I had visited the area years earlier during a weekend getaway. I remembered how peaceful it felt. The lake stretched for miles beneath a bright blue sky, and small cottages lined the shoreline. As I walked along the water, I realized something surprising. I was not imagining a future centered around Ryan anymore. I was imagining a future centered around myself. That thought would have made me feel guilty once. Not anymore. A few days later, Ryan called again. This time his voice sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. He spoke about honeymoon plans, work projects, and several minor updates that seemed strangely rehearsed. Eventually the conversation shifted. Vanessa and I have been talking about the future, he said. We are thinking about expanding the family one day. I listened quietly. That is nice, I replied. And we have been discussing housing options too. The market is so expensive right now. There it was. The real reason for the call. I remained silent. Ryan continued speaking. The location of your house is incredible. Properties around there are selling for amazing prices. I looked out the window toward the backyard. The maple tree swayed gently in the breeze. Yes, I said. It is valuable. Ryan laughed softly. Dad always chose good investments. The conversation ended a few minutes later, but his words stayed with me. Not because they surprised me, because they confirmed everything Thomas had warned me about. Ryan was already speaking about the property as though it were part of his future plans. He was building expectations on a foundation that did not belong to him. That evening, I opened my laptop and contacted a highly respected real estate agent named Susan Parker. Her reputation was excellent, and she specialized in premium properties. The next morning, she arrived at the house carrying a notebook and a tablet. She spent nearly 2 hours examining every room. She measured spaces, reviewed upgrades, and photographed the property. When she finally sat down with me in the dining room, her eyes widened slightly. Eleanor, this home is exceptionally desirable. I nodded. If I decided to sell, how quickly could it happen? Susan studied me carefully before answering. In this market, much faster than most people would expect. For the first time in weeks, a genuine smile appeared on my face. Not because I had made a final decision. Not yet. But because I now knew something that Ryan and Vanessa did not. The future they had already planned in their minds was resting on assumptions. And assumptions have a way of collapsing when reality finally arrives. 3 weeks after signing the paperwork, everything became real. The sale had closed smoothly. The funds had been transferred. The keys had been handed over. Most of my personal belongings were already settled into my new lakeside home. It was smaller than the old house, but it felt lighter somehow. Every window looked out toward the water. Every morning began with sunlight dancing across the lake. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. Meanwhile, I had heard very little from Ryan. A few brief messages. A few missed calls. Nothing unusual. If anything, the silence suggested that he and Vanessa remained completely confident about the future they believed was waiting for them. Then came Friday afternoon. I was sitting on the back porch reading a novel when my phone rang. The screen displayed Ryan's name. Something about the timing felt different. I answered. Mom. His voice sounded strained. Yes. There was a pause. I just drove past your house. I looked out across the lake. Did you? Another silence. Longer this time. There is a sold sign in the yard. I closed my book. Yes. What does that mean? The question was so unexpected that I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because he genuinely did not understand. It means the house was sold. I heard a sharp breath on the other end. Sold to who? To the new owners. More silence followed. Then I heard another voice in the background. Vanessa. Her tone was urgent, demanding answers, asking questions faster than Ryan could respond. For years I had imagined what this conversation might feel like if it ever happened. Strangely, I felt calm. Mom, Ryan said carefully, there must be some misunderstanding. There is no misunderstanding. But why would you sell? I thought about that question, not because I needed an answer, because I had too many. The wedding, the years of exclusions, the assumptions, the disrespect disguised as inconvenience, the expectation that I would simply remain in place until someone else decided what happened next. Because it was my house, I said quietly. Vanessa's voice suddenly became louder in the background. Ryan tried to interrupt her. The conversation grew increasingly tense on their side of the call. On mine, the lake remained perfectly still. Finally, Ryan spoke again. We need to talk. We are talking. No. In person. I looked across the water where a pair of ducks drifted near the shoreline. Why? He hesitated. Because this affects all of us. There it was again. The assumption. The belief that decisions about my property somehow required their approval. Ryan, I said gently, the sale is complete. The words landed heavily. I could hear it in his silence. For the first time, reality had arrived. Not the future he imagined. The actual future. Where are you living now? He asked. I am doing very well. Vanessa spoke again, and this time I caught a few words. None of them sounded pleased. Ryan lowered his voice. Can we meet tomorrow? I considered the request. Part of me wanted to decline. Another part knew this conversation had been coming for years. Tomorrow afternoon, I said. One meeting. After the call ended, I placed my phone on the table and watched the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon. The water reflected shades of gold and orange. Somewhere behind me, a wind chime moved gently in the breeze. Across town, Ryan and Vanessa were finally confronting a truth they had never expected. The future they had spent years planning no longer existed. And tomorrow, for the first time, they would have to face the person they had spent so long underestimating. The next afternoon, Ryan and Vanessa arrived exactly on time. I had chosen a small cafe overlooking the lake, rather than inviting them into my new home. Some parts of my life were private now. They walked toward the table together, but neither looked particularly confident. Ryan appeared tired. Vanessa looked uncomfortable. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Ryan sat down and folded his hands together. Mom, we need to understand why you did this. I looked out at the water before answering. You mean why I sold my house? He nodded. Yes. I took a slow sip of tea. The better question is why you assumed I would not. Silence settled over the table. Vanessa shifted in her chair. We never thought you would make such a major decision without discussing it with family. The statement almost made me smile. Not because it was amusing, because it revealed everything. For years, decisions had been made without me. Holiday plans, family gatherings, important conversations. Somehow those exclusions never required discussion. Yet the moment I made a decision for myself, consultation suddenly became important. Ryan lowered his eyes. That is not fair. Is it not? I asked gently. Neither of them answered. The lake shimmered behind us in the afternoon sun. A boat drifted slowly across the water. Around us, ordinary conversations continued at nearby tables. The world moved forward as it always does. Ryan, I said quietly, do you remember when you were 12 and broke your arm riding your bicycle? He looked surprised by the question. Of course. I spent 3 nights sleeping in a chair beside your hospital bed because you were afraid to be alone. His expression softened. I continued. Do you remember college tuition? He nodded. Your father and I worked extra years to make sure you graduated without debt. The table fell silent again. This is not about money, I said. It never was. Vanessa stared down at her hands. Ryan finally spoke. Then what is it about? I looked directly at him. Respect. The word remained between us. Simple. Unavoidable. A house can be replaced, I said. Respect cannot. Neither of them interrupted. For the first time, they seemed willing to listen. I told them about the years of being left out, the invitations that never came, the assumptions that grew larger every year, the way I had slowly become an afterthought in my own family. I spoke calmly. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. Facts rarely require volume. When I finished, Ryan looked away toward the lake. Vanessa remained silent for several seconds. Then she finally spoke. I did not realize you felt that way. I considered the statement carefully. That was part of the problem. Another long silence followed. Eventually Ryan looked back at me. I am sorry. This time the words sounded genuine. Not perfect. Not magical. Just honest. And honesty was enough. I nodded. Thank you. The conversation lasted another hour. Some questions were answered. Others were not. Certain wounds heal slowly. Some never disappear completely. When the meeting ended, I stood and gathered my purse. Ryan rose from his chair. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who once ran through the backyard chasing baseballs. Will we see you again? He asked. I smiled softly. That depends on what kind of relationship you want to build. Then I turned and walked toward my car. The evening sun reflected across the lake in ribbons of gold. My new life waited just a few minutes away. A smaller house. A quieter future. A future that belonged to me. As I drove home, I felt no anger. No desire for revenge. Only peace. They had spent years believing they knew exactly how my story would end. In the end, the greatest surprise was discovering that I still had the power to write it myself.